want to start with a little about your story, and if I can summarise what we know. Obviously, you had a really successful career in factual TV, in media and digital news, and worked at the BBC as a factual producer and executive producer for a long time, and then had, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, that stint in Chinese television and digital news, which is fascinating in a different way. And obviously very well known for your campaigning work and your strong voice on diversity, equality, representation and justice issues with the RTS, and now a CEO at the film and TV charity and chair of RADA. Throughout it all, as a powerful voice for challenging those power imbalances, calling out lack of diversity, campaigning for greater representation, and we'll flag it right now, which I'm sure you want to later, but the forthcoming book, The Big Payback, which is next month, I think, released, that you've written with Lenny Henry about reparations for slavery.
Yeah, we'd love to know where the passion you have comes from. Was it always there? Was it brought on by a special event? Did something happen to make you become a champion of diversity?
So my family are relatively, my parents are relatively left-wing. They were members of the Labour Party. And I'd like to say the biggest influence of that is it put me off fireworks for my up until about 25, 26, because we'd always go to the Labour Party, local Labour Party fireworks night. And they were terrible. They were at the North London Labour Party fireworks. I don't know what they're like now, but in the 1970s, they were absolutely atrocious. And I thought I didn't like fireworks. And it wasn't until I was well into my 20s that I realized fireworks could actually be fun. But in terms of a left-leaning politic, I think I got that, and a progressive politic, I think I got that from my parents. And when I was 16, I enrolled in a film producing course, motivated like most 16-year-old boys in the quest of getting a girlfriend, because I went to an all-boys school and I saw this advertised that there was a filmmaking course, and I thought, wow, this would be great. But I was unsuccessful in my quest to get a girlfriend. But I was successful, or what happened was that it introduced me to black film and cinema. It was the course was run by a black film workshop called Black Film Collective, called Chedo, and it coincided with the first black and Asian MP, so Keith Vaz, Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, being elected. So I think that was about 1987, I think. So it coincided with that. And what was interesting was that was a seminal moment in Black British history. That was a seminal moment in British history. And yet the only people that were filming these prospective MPs at the time was Chedo, was this black collective. And so that rang bells for me, even as a teenager, that this important piece of history would be lost if it wasn't for Chedo and if it wasn't for black people behind the camera. So I might not be able to articulate it that well, but I realized at that age the massive importance of having black representation behind the camera, making the editorial decisions of what is and isn't filmed and what is and isn't important. So I would say, if I'm trying to answer your question of was there a seminal moment, or I think possibly the thing that changed my life, that put me on the direction of recognizing the importance of black filmmaking, was Chedo. And seeing that was really important to me. Then obviously things happen, you know, you have a political awakening, etc., when you go to university and, you know, and what have you, which I could wax lyrical for hours. But yeah, I would actually put it down to coming from relatively left-leaning parents and the inability to get a girlfriend.
I just add in there, separate association, but at a campaigning meeting years and years ago when I lived in London, Bernie Grant had an incredible impression on me. It spent 20 minutes because I asked a question and he came up to me afterwards and said, I'm going to answer your question properly because you didn't get it answered from the panel. And 20 minutes where I felt like I got educated on why representation in politics had failed, and I should basically, as an entitled white person, Jewish white person, but I should be doing better. And I just thought, wow, it really stuck with me. I think I was 19. So yeah. And is David Lammy in Bernie Grant's seat?
Yeah,
is the now Deputy Prime Minister?
That's right. Yeah.
We saw a clip of you talking about children and representation. Do you feel things have changed since you were a child?
Ooh, have things changed in representation since I was a child in film and television representation? Um, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I have a 9-year-old child. About a year ago, 2 years ago, I was watching the film version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the lack of racial diversity in it, because that was made, I think, in the early 2000s. So the lack of racial diversity in it was really striking compared to I take him to the cinema and we watch films, or watch a film at least once a week with him. I really love making sure that he watches films. Um, and so if you compare what he's watching now in the films which are produced now for children compared to what was being made just 20 years ago, it's incredibly striking. I mean, it looks like I was going to say the films are so white in their casting just 20 years ago compared to now. So yes, no doubt things have changed. Having said that, I think what has happened is that there has been a massive shift in racial diversity of the main characters. There's been less of a shift in terms of representations of communities. And I think that's really important. And so what it is that you see highly functioning, strong protagonists, black, brown, Asian protagonists, but they are normally inhabiting white worlds. You know, black worlds or Asian worlds are still filled with those stereotypes. Black worlds are still filled with a bunch of drug dealers and crime. Asian worlds are invariably, there is something slightly wrong with them, forced marriages, etc. When you see communities represented, diverse, it's striking. It jumps out. So the Marvel, I think it was Miss Marvel, that really showed a fantastic representation of South Asian community in America. It was brilliant. But the fact that that's such a rarity in it, and I can use that as an example, and it jumps out to me, shows that normally when I'm watching Marvel films, it's not a black community, even if it's a black character, you know. Or, controversial here, the rest of the Marvel heroes live in the real world. So they're swinging through New York, California, flying wherever they are in the real world. And yet when it comes to Africa, they feel that Africa is so dysfunctional that they have to make up a country, right, for the Black Panther. So we can talk, and I'm sure that you'll have people, you know, Marvel fans who would want to absolutely argue with me on this, and there can be an entire podcast. I'm sure it'd actually do very well if we start to dissect Marvel superheroes. But the bottom line is that are there positive representations of communities? And I don't think that has progressed that far since my childhood. Sesame Street was around when I was a child, and I don't think things have got that much better or there's that much more. And that's one of the reasons Sesame Street was so successful, because it showed a representation of a positive community, not just positive individuals. But does my 9-year-old child have positive individuals and role models that they can point to and be like, wow, I want to be like him or her? Absolutely. And I think that has improved over the last just 10 years. So yes, would be churlish to say that there hasn't been improvement.
To sort of segue into our next question as well, I think that's fascinating. Yeah. I wish my son, who has his eyes on Ryder amongst other drama schools, was here, because he would have interesting conversations with you about the Marvel stuff and cultural appropriation, all sorts of stuff in there.
I'm sure I'd be out of my depth.
Yeah,
I'm sure. Well,
as am I.
One debate with any 19-year-old, I'd be out of my depth.
Yeah, me too. But it's interesting. I wonder whether do you have a similar view on representation in news media and journalism? Do you think that's progressed in quite the same ways? It feels like there is some progression, but I know that you've talked quite in no uncertain terms, even in the last few years, about how we still haven't moved far enough on both sides of the camera and in print journalism as well.
So I think news journalism is really interesting as to whether that has progressed or not. And I would argue that looking at, shameless plug for the book which is coming out soon, The Big Payback, the case for reparations for slavery and how they would work, by myself and Lenny Henry, coming out 8th of October, available to pre-order now. So I would argue that that's an example of showing how the news agenda hasn't moved, right? Because if all CARICOM support reparations. So Caribbean countries support reparations for slavery. The African Union, I think it was last year or the year before, made it the year of reparations. So Africa is behind, African countries are predominantly behind reparations. So it's a non-controversial subject for large swathes of the world, right? And yet it's not represented or it's hardly touched on in British newsrooms. And when it is touched on, it's normally seen as a fringe controversial subject, right? And so what we have is British newsrooms treating what is basically mainstream thinking in large parts of the world as if it's a fringe subject, right? And so that's an example of how, yes, we might have a few more Clive Murrays in front of the camera, which is great. I love Clive. I've worked with Clive, right? So we might have a few more Clive Murrays in front of the camera, but the values that underpin a lot of our news reporting are still predominantly values which are held by white, middle class, British people, normally in the southeast of England. So in that sense, I'm not sure it's really moved on.
So just to sort of build on that product, I think we would feel the same. We're really proud of some of the bits of progress we've made as a network of citizen journalism publications. We'll come back to later on, but we think we experience some of the same challenges. But just interesting. So we've seen the rise of those anti-immigration protests in recent years, in recent months. There's been the erosion of human rights in a number of places. Absolutely, social media has a proliferation of racist ideas and theories and ideologies. I'm interested in how you see the connection between representation, the progress made and not made in that, and the proliferation and development of those ideas right now. And what do you think that journalists, and I guess in our context, citizens who aspire to journalistic ethics, can do to really counter that shift rightwards?
So about 15 years ago, there was a really good study by, oh God, her name will come to me, which showed that, and there was a debate. This was kind of before Twitter and social media was such a dominant force. And it was more about platforming and whether the BBC should platform the BNP, or it might have been back when the NF was being platformed on Question Time and stuff. So there was a lot of debate about platforming. And what the research showed was that platforming made very little difference as to the success of the parties, right? What really contributed to whether something was successful or not, whether a right-wing party was successful or not, was the prominence of the issue. And so if the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, this is old research, so I don't know if it still holds, but it feels instinctively that it does. So if the news media platforms an issue as being important, so as immigration being really important, then the parties who have the biggest issues and focus on immigration don't need to be platformed per se, right, for them to come to rise to prominence and be seen as viable options. And so sometimes it's less platforming of the parties or of those voices and platforming of those issues. So we've got to ask ourselves, why are some issues come to prominence? Because the truth is, I live in London. I lived in Glasgow before. I'm not saying that people coming across in small boats is not an issue, but I don't see it. I mean, I don't come into day-to-day contact with small boats at all. Right? There are lots of things I do not come into contact with at all. Right? And the only reason I know whether it's quote unquote important is when the issue is platformed by the news media which I consume. And so what we need to ask ourselves, and this goes back to the question and the issue of reparations that I brought up, is who is deciding which issues are important and who is deciding which issues are not important. So if you decide that reparations are important, and if our newsrooms were packed full of people who have the same values as people from the Caribbean and from Africa, they would be saying, I suggest, that Britain needing to pay reparations for slavery and colonialism is incredibly important. And therefore, people arguing for that would then rise in prominence, whether you've platformed them or not. Right? So I think sometimes we get too caught up in how many minutes or hours has Nigel Farage had compared to the leader of the Lib Dems or compared to whatever. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need to look at that. Of course, we need to look at that. We need to look at the hours that people get. And I worked at the BBC and I didn't work on Question Time, but I worked on the equivalent type of programs in Scotland. And I would have long discussions with editorial policy at the BBC to make sure that I would get the mix of how much Labour was represented, how much the SNP were represented, how many Greens were represented. So it is important. I'm not saying we just ignore that. But I think the part of the debate that we're not looking at, which is where the journalists and the editors and the chief editors need to look at themselves, is what are the issues that we're deciding are important? Because it's the platform of those issues that invariably has a massive effect. And I would argue, and there's a few studies to support it, I would argue that has a bigger effect than the platforming of individuals.
Lots to reflect on for us, Anna, in editorial teams and our publications there, I think.
Yeah, no. So you're absolutely right. So what it means is that it causes the journalist to reflect on our power and our actions. And that's often uncomfortable for us to do as journalists. Right. And so it's often more comfortable. And we prefer, even if we're being criticized, we prefer the debate to be about, has the leader of the Labour Party had enough minutes? Has the leader of the Conservative Party had enough minutes? Have the leader of Reform had enough minutes? Or too few or too many? Right? Because then it's not really about us. Whereas sometimes I think the debate needs to be about us. And then all of a sudden it becomes a quite uncomfortable debate where we look at our own personal prejudice and values and biases.
So next, we'd like to talk more about what we can see right now in film and TV and perhaps media more generally. In 2022, you told Back2 that there was a failure on an industrial scale in terms of representation, diversity and equality in the industry. Can you explain a bit more about what you mean?
Yeah, sure. So I think that often when we talk about diversity and inclusion and equity, we see it as a problem of headcount with regards to, are there enough disabled people? Are there enough LGBTQ people? Are there enough black people? Etc., etc. And then we can see, well, how do we make sure that we have 2 more black people in senior positions? How do we make sure that we have 3%, people with visible disabilities in these kind of roles or whatever, right? Whereas what I have learned, or the experience that I had, or the experience that really shaped the way that I look at this, is moving to Scotland and regional diversity, right? And I moved to Scotland to be an exec producer in Scotland, head of current affairs from 2007 to 2015. And what was interesting about that is the debate about regional diversity is that they didn't care about headcount. They very rarely talked about, is there a Scottish person who is controller of BBC One? Is there a Scottish person who is in a powerful position at Channel 4? It wasn't about that. What they recognised was that the actual structures of BBC, of ITV, the actual structures of Channel 4, of with regards to who has commissioning power, where the commissioning spend is, how they decide that, there was a market failure. And they needed to change those structures. Right? And so learning from that, and a really good example, if you take it away from the media, a really good example is when New Labour, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came in back in, God, when was that, 1990, blah, blah, blah. 94, thank you. Right? When they came in, and if you look at that cabinet in Westminster was very Scottish, disproportionately so. Right? And yet they recognised that it wasn't about having Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, who comes out as English, but really, if you look at him, he's very Scottish in many ways in terms of his education, where he was born, where he grew up, etc. Right. So if you look at Tony Blair, you look at Gordon Brown, you look at Alistair Darling, you look at so many of those massive Scottish contingent in that first cabinet, and that they realised that if you wanted Scottish representation, it wasn't about how many people you had down in Westminster. It was about you had to change the system. You had to devolve power. Right? And so similarly, it feels as if when it comes to the media, when it comes to racial diversity, when it comes to disabled diversity, when it comes to other forms of diversity, we're looking at the equivalent of how many black and brown and disabled people do we have at Westminster, when what we really need to do is look at how do we devolve the system? How do we change the system so that the power structures are different and so that they actually help work for the purposes of black and brown and disabled people and LGBTQ people and working class people and all the forms of diversity, you know. And so when I was talking to Bector that there has been a failure on a systemic failure, I think, you know, what I'm talking about is not about do we have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points or even 10 percentage points or how we count diversity. It's more we need to change the structures. How are the structures failing us? And so that's what I meant by that. And those structures still haven't been changed.
Yeah, fascinating. So Blair and Brown as leader and Shadow Chancellor 94, elected first Labour government in the Blair government in 97. So interesting, just listening to you saying that, is there's an obvious follow-on question really, which is, you know, if we need to change the structure of those system, and you were working within the system and the structure of the system for years before that, and then a couple of years after making that statement to Beck to become CEO of a charity which is concerned with the welfare of people in the film and TV industry. So yeah, what motivated that shift, and what's been different about trying to make those changes from within a very old and respected, important charity in the infrastructure of the system? But yeah, what's different about trying to make those changes or advocate for those changes from there, as opposed to trying to make them from the inside, perhaps broadcaster or as a producer?
I think it's very difficult to make structural changes within an organization. Right? And the reason I say that is I think that what you're having to do within an organization is that unless that organization is seen as failing, right, you are trying to maximize the survival of that organization. And that normally means tinkering around the edges, maximizing how it produces profits as it currently stands, you know, or whatever the KPI is. It might not be profits, it might be audience sizes when it comes to the BBC, it might be something else, you know. So it's not always profits, it's not always the profit motive, but it's how you increase whatever the key performance indicator is. And so I think it's really difficult if you, within that organization, to say, forget about those KPIs. What we need to do is change the whole structure because it's not functioning well for another group that, you know, or we need to change the KPIs completely. I think that's really difficult to do, you know. Whereas I think it's easier outside of an organization to sometimes point to the flaws in that organization or to campaign as to why it needs to change. And as sometimes being within an organization, it's useful, especially if you want change, it's really useful to have those outside agitators, you know. So you can call on those outside agitators. You can bring attention to those outside agitators, saying, it's not just me that wants this. It's so and so who is calling for this. It is, I worked at the BBC, and my second job at the BBC was my first job was I worked for Watchdog as a junior researcher. Watchdog, the consumer magazine program. My second job was working as a researcher for Reportage, which was part of youth programs.
Yeah.
And that was based in Manchester. And that was in 93, right? And so there has been a desire by people within the BBC, and an honest desire by people within the BBC to move out of London, right? But as always, the pull of London, right? If your key raison d'etre is to get larger audiences, if how you're judged and whether you get promotion is whether you're able to do it cheaply, right? The pull of London is too great. Right? It's really hard, even if you want to do the best thing, which is like move your productions outside of London, be less London centric, right? Working within the organisation, given the remit that you have, it's really hard not to keep on fighting that massive London centric pull. Right? You have economies of scale. You have a really experienced and highly skilled workforce. London attracts even more skilled workforce. I can go into all the positives, not positives, all the reasons why London is appealing. Positives is a judgmental word, but all the reasons why London is appealing, right? But what it took was political will and MPs outside of London, right? And other stakeholders outside of the BBC, Ofcom for one, right? And independent production companies based outside of London, right? To say, no, we need to make sure that it's in the license fee, that it is in a license requirement, that the BBC needs to make more productions outside London. Now, I would say that those people they positively helped the people within the BBC who wanted to do the right thing. Right? And so we shouldn't try and paint a picture of that there are evil people in the BBC or evil people within any large organisation, right, who are stopping progressive change and what have you. My experience is that's rarely the case. My experience is that normally there are lots of good people within these large bureaucracies, within these large organisations. What they need is the support from outside of that organisation. And that support can sometimes be seen as and viewed as agitation or campaigning or whatever. But it's playing those roles. Both things, even if they look like occasionally that they're in conflict, can actually support each other.
And are you finding in your work with the film and TV charity that you're having that leverage? Are you able to campaign and push some of those institutions in the ways you'd like? How's it going, I guess?
Our key campaign right now is creating a pan-industry set of mental health standards. So we view our work as in two ways. We view our upstream work and our downstream work. Our downstream work is addressing the immediate need of people in immediate need. So that's people in immediate well-being need that need therapy sessions, need to call our 24-hour support line, or be in immediate financial hardship. So they need our hardship funds. So that's our downstream work. There are people in immediate need right now. But what I've also made sure that we're focusing on, it existed before I took over the CEO position here, but I've tried to strengthen it, is our upstream work. So our upstream work is looking at addressing the causes of poor mental health, addressing the causes of financial precarity, and so that means that I'm speaking at House of Commons and House of Lords select committees so that hopefully they can bring in those policies. It's bringing in the whole picture toolkit, which is how do production companies set up their productions in as mentally healthy way as possible. And it's then talking to not just the heads of the production companies, not just the commissioning bodies like BBC, ITV, Disney, etc., but also talking to Ofcom, talking to the regulators, engaging contacts which I'd made previously at the Scottish government, engaging with the Welsh government, engaging with central government as well. So recognizing that there's a whole variety of different stakeholders if we want to address the upstream work. And there was days where I think this is fantastic and we're doing absolutely brilliantly. And, I will come out of a meeting and maybe not pop the champagne, but, I'll be really happy. And there are days when I feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall and, go home and want to cry. So today I think I'm doing really well. So you've caught me on a good day.
That's good.
So that's good. So I'm not going home to cry today. But we have good days and bad days.
That's pretty well. It's good to hear that there are good days, because it sometimes feels in the world now that it's challenging, isn't it, to push those more important progressive things that are in people's interest. I wonder if we can just go backwards a little bit in time and think about your career in factual TV a little bit more, including up to the time you're in China, and kind of two very different contexts, I guess, working in the UK and Glasgow and then across to China. And in that time, you've done your fair share of, and you've talked about some of it already, fair share of investigative journalism, speaking truth to power, making sure that people's rights are met. We find that in our terrain, our citizen journalists do quite a bit of that, but we find that with the changes that we've experienced in the industry, particularly in regional journalism in this country, but I think this is true everywhere, there's less of that serious investigative, let's look under the surface of this challenge, social challenge, or look into this organization or this business or whatever than there used to be. And I'm wondering, given what's happening in the world right now, what are your hopes and fears for that kind of investigative journalism? What do we have to do to keep it alive at this point, based on the experience you've had in those other contexts?
So I think it's really easy when you look at the downturn in good investigative journalism to blame it on two things. To either blame it on the money, right? To say that there's not enough money, which there isn't. The advertising revenue that was coming in to newspapers and investigative journalism, there's no doubt it's decimated. I'm speaking to you on the 11th of September, and I think it was 2 days ago that Reach just made mass redundancies. So whether you're supporting Byline or whether you're supporting publications by Reach, the bottom line is that the financial model for journalism is not strong, to put it bluntly. So it's, whether, as I said, irrespective of what you're buying, the example of Reach shows that the financial model is weak. So we can either blame it on the financial model, or sometimes we blame it on the audience, saying, oh, they're just interested in TikTok videos now, and so they're not interested in really strong, proper journalism, and that's true as well. Our tastes change and what have you. But I bring a third thing into the equation, and that was talking to a BBC journalist who went on to be a lecturer at Westminster. And I think he just coined the term just off the cuff. And I don't think he even realized that he coined the term, but it's one which I picked up and I was like, okay, I'm going to use that. And it's been 20 years since he coined it, or since he said it to me in a off the cuff remark. And I use it now constantly, which is journalism of consequence. Right. And for me, journalism of consequence is, does the journalism that you produce, does it have consequence in the real world? Right. And what was interesting for me is that growing up, you would have a piece of television like Death on the Rock, which was about the police shoot to kill policy with regards to the IRA. You would have a piece of journalism, television journalism, like I think it was is it Death of a Princess, which was about the execution of a woman in Iran, I think it was. Like this is all 1970s stuff when I was a kid. And that would change government policy. That would have that would be journalism of consequence. That would change Britain's international relationship with Iran. That would there'd be questions in Parliament about it, and it would have real consequence. And up until recently, there'd be real, and when I say recently, I mean up until 20 years ago, I think that often journalism had real journalism of consequence, right? Why would I engage in journalism without consequence? That's the big question. If your journalism doesn't have any consequence, then it's no more important in many ways than a piece of fiction. And fiction is normally better. It's more interesting. So we need journalism of consequence. And the problem is that due to shifting political climate, due to the way that politicians interact with journalism, due to that whole how the public interact with politicians and how they interact with journalism, etc., has changed. And so creating journalism of consequence is really difficult now, and the epitome of that, I think you saw during COVID, when you saw politicians who were being exposed for breaking some of the most fundamental rules that have been put in place, that they had put in place with regards to COVID, being exposed and then facing no consequence. Right? So the journalism, which was actually really revealing, had no consequence. Right? What was the point of me consuming that journalism? Why would I want to consume that journalism if it has no consequence? So I think finance of journalism, the financial model of journalism, absolutely different consumer taste changing. We need to look at that. But we need to, and this is the hardest question, how do we bring back journalism of consequence? Because there's some great investigative journalism that's being done. There is no doubt. But it's not having any consequence. Why is that? And I don't have the answer to that.
We wonder if it's, I think in our context, whether some of that's about real local connection and understanding where the things are, where there's a consequential act you can have by writing about it, because you know it authoritatively from a local level. It's a brilliant story in our East Anglia Bylines publication of an investigation by a local person written under a pen name when we published it to protect their identity for risk of reprisals, who uncovered that there was a unit in the local council, Essex Council in this case, where people were posing as police officers and using fake warrant cards to take money off people and lock them up and repossess goods and do all sorts of other stuff. And over 3 or 4 articles of investigation over a year and a bit, that's led to censure being placed on the council and that unit being closed down. So there is a consequence, but it's partly because it's so local, so clear, somebody can see it, it's tangible in people's lives, that we're tapping into that vein of desire for something to change by articulating the story. So maybe it's about where you focus the lens to some degree.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So maybe it is about the, to use the horrible old BBC phrase, news you can use.
Yeah.
So yeah. You're if you're doing it, then that's brilliant. Not if. The fact you are doing it, that's brilliant. But that for me is, how do we create journalism?
I've been wondering about censorship. We've traditionally heard a lot about censorship in countries like China, but it seems to be spreading a bit. And recently, a certain political party here has even told their councillors that they can't talk to the press, the local councillors. How do you deal with that? How have you managed to work within the concept of state censorship?
The problem is really, okay, how would I phrase this? What is state censorship achieving in a globalized world? So if the British state doesn't want something to be reported on, but it's being reported on outside of the world and in other countries, and I have access to that, the power of the state censor, I think, is a blunt tool. The censorship which I am more concerned about is the censorship of the insidious censorship of collective thinking. So, for example, take the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What was really interesting for me about that is that there were several UN votes about that invasion of Ukraine, right? And with those UN votes to censor Russia, right? And with those UN votes, you either had abstentions or voting against by China, by India, and I think, if not over 50%, close to 50% of countries in Africa, right? And so what you had was, if you take it population-wise, you actually had the majority of the world's population not censoring Russia. Obviously, Russia didn't do that, right? And you had the second biggest economy, China, not censoring Russia. And you had large swathes of African countries not censoring Russia. Yet the headlines that ran, right? So this is irrespective of whether you support. Trust me, when I say this, I always have to add the caveat: I am not a Putin supporter, right? Because, and it's ridiculous that I have to say that, but I'm just putting it out there, right? But the headlines that ran were that the world votes against Russia. The opinion in British press and British media that the world was not censoring Russia was seen as basically, and I've just proven it, being pro-Putin, which was ridiculous, right? Because that headline and the headlines that you saw with those UN votes saying that the world votes against Russia and what have you, by so many criteria, were just wrong, right? If you had a UN vote and America, which is the largest economy, no one would ever dream of running a headline when the world's largest economy doesn't vote for censorship, of saying that the world votes against X or the world votes against Y. No one would dream of doing that. And yet when China doesn't do it, we just dismiss it as, oh yeah, China was just friends of Russia. So it doesn't even matter. We don't need to, we can just write them off. And so for me, when you talk about state censorship is a blunt tool. We can look at that and look at it quite easily, saying, oh, wow, then, state censorship of China means they're not reporting on Tibet. State censorship of Russia means that they're not talking about X. And that's true. And that doesn't mean that we need to just pretend it doesn't exist. And we definitely need to address it. But being in Britain, I'm more worried about the censorship of creeping biases, right, where certain opinions, like whether, again, going back to the beginning of this conversation, whether reparations is a fringe issue, whether the world did censor Russia. It's those things which I'm more concerned about, because the state censorship is normally relatively easy to point out.
A Bylines Network, we're a citizen-led organization driven by volunteers. And most of us are passionate about championing unheard voices, being inclusive as much as we can, giving opportunities to people of all kinds of backgrounds who face all kinds of different challenges and barriers. We do have some success, like having more female editors than any of the national news organizations, and carrying a lot of first-person stories, for instance, our Gaza series. But we still find that the demographic of writers is not as diverse as we would like it. How can we change that dynamic?
So I think it's a really hard one, especially when you're talking about limited finance. It's something which I experience as a trustee of a charity. Because I'm the chair of RADA, which is a charity. So the trustees don't get paid any money. So as much as we want to diversify the trustee makeup, we have a problem, because it's people who can afford to dedicate large amounts of time for free. And that immediately pushes it to has a class bias in mind. Having said that, if you look at lots of revolutions, if you look at lots of people dedicating their time to charity rather than being on the boards of charity, right? They are quote unquote people on low pay. They are lots of people. If they believe in a cause, they will dedicate lots of hours to it, irrespective of how much money they have. So I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we make sure that people feel really passionate about what they're doing, so that so they will dedicate that time. So don't get me wrong, there are lots of structural problems that we can point to. Women carry the vast majority of childcare, and so that can eat up their spare time. Richer people often have more spare time as well, or have more flexible working hours if you're a white collar worker compared to a blue collar worker, so therefore they can go to the editorial meeting of this or go to the charitable trustee meeting of that, which is normally in office hours when they'd actually be working. And so there are lots of structural and annoying things like that, which stops the diversity. But as I said, I've seen, and history is littered with, people dedicating poor people from diverse backgrounds, people from marginalized backgrounds, from flipping slave revolutions to toll puddle martyrs to you name it, right? Who are not saying, "Oh, I'd love to take part in that rebellion, but you know what? If I was middle class, I could." But I just, so I don't think we can just look at those structural things. We need to address them, absolutely. But we need to look at why people are not passionate as well. I think the acid test for diversity for me is, especially when it comes to journalism, are they producing a piece of journalism that I would not commission and I do not like? Right? And until they are, then there's not real diversity. Right? What we kind of want is we want the woman to do, you can do that really interesting stuff about perimenopause and your struggles, and it's stuff I really agree with as well. Yeah, or Jewish guy, you can do that really interesting stuff about anti-Semitism and inclusion, and that's really interesting. But as long as I more or less agree with it, it's good that you're doing that and you've got that perspective. But it's basically we have the same worldview. And so, that's fine, right? And invariably, that's how editorial in journalism and media, how so much journalism is, or diversity is framed in journalism, is that, yes, I want the woman's perspective as long as her values and what she's producing are more or less the same as mine, right? Yes, I can have the disabled person writing some really interesting piece, but as long as their values and what they believe in are more or less the same as mine, right? The acid test for diversity is when you have that disabled person writing of you, which challenges you. And you're like, oh, wow, okay, fine. That's not something I would have commissioned. But that's when you know you've got proper diversity. That's when you know you've got that you properly devolved the power. That's the acid test. And unless you get that, unless you get some pieces where you're just like, wow, I wouldn't have done that if that Asian person or that Muslim person or that Jewish person or that Hindu person or whatever, right, is producing pieces that I would not like, but they are speaking to a different audience. They are giving us a different perspective, right? That's when you know you've got diversity. And invariably, that's when the person then feels ownership. It's no longer, and when they've got ownership, when they feel they've got ownership, that's when they want to write. That's what will motivate them, despite the fact that they might have childcare duties, despite the fact that they might not have as much free time, despite the fact that, whatever, So I think that's the acid test, and often our diversity when it comes to journalism and lots of different organizations and lots of different fields of life and lots of different sectors fail that acid test.
Fascinating. How do you reckon with that as an editor-in-chief, Anna?
Yeah, I'm just thinking I'm going to have to go through all our articles. We do publish stuff that
That's
you
great.
might not like, or stuff that I think, I wouldn't have said that, or what are you on about? But, as long as it's someone's opinion and it doesn't go too far.
Because that I think is also the really difficult part, right? Because as a publication, you need to have values. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, what's the point of having a publication? So you need to have values. The real difficulty is knowing where are your values. Your values are obviously societal, created by society, influenced by culture, right? And so where do your values, how do you make sure that your values are by definition culturally specific, right? And so it's a really, there's no easy answer to that when you're talking about diversity and then talking about making sure that, that it has those values. If it was easy, right? But those are the really difficult things that we have to grapple with. So yeah. So it's not a criticism. It's just making sure that we are aware that when we talk about diversity, we're not talking about, do we have a few more women? Do we have a few more disabled people? Do we, it's hard. It is really, really hard.
But also there's a logic that follows there, isn't there? If you don't present that plurality of experiences and opinions, and we pride ourselves on fact-based journalism, but you can draw lots of conclusions from facts in different directions. So, and we carry lots of opinion. But why would somebody else in our model, which is if you read something that we've got and it interests you and you think I'd like to put something in there, then approach us and we'll look at publishing your article. You don't have to be a professional journalist to do that. If you can't see one of a perspective you share somewhere in what we publish, what's your incentive to come with forward with your own thing? So it's get this, or a perspective you disagree with, but know you've got the opportunity to disagree with that. So because you kind of got to create the loop, I suppose, haven't you? The open door comes from plurality, perhaps.
It's so hard. So my wife is Kenyan, and the example that she sometimes talks about is when Britain cracked down on FGM in, I think it was like in the 1950s, as FGM then increased, right? And it increased because it was seen as a way of actually resisting European influence and imposition of British culture and values. And it puts you, and it definitely puts me as a non-Kenyan man in an insidious position, right? And because the last thing I want to do, and if you look at my values, which I think are, I would like to think are universal, just as I stated, I am not a Putin supporter, right? Just for the record, I'm pretty sure it's pretty clear, I am anti-FGM. At the same time, I am definitely, if I was around at that time, I would definitely be in favour of making sure that Kenyans were able to express their cultural values, their cultural beliefs, right, against the imposition of British rule and British beliefs. Where the hell do I stand on that? And even taking a stance, do I make things better or worse? Or do I have the luxury of not being Kenyan, of then just saying, you know what, I'm not in this discussion. And so therefore I'm then abdicating any responsibility for the women who are experiencing, mutilation. And so that's just a really simple example, right? But when you start to get into the details of some of the tougher issues, and who are you giving a voice to, and whose values are you promoting, and what are the real world consequences of promoting those values, it becomes really difficult, so that's why you need people like Anna. That's why you need people who are willing to grapple with those issues, to be in positions of power, to have those responsibilities, because it's not easy. It's not as easy as, we just need to have a few more black people or a few more, disabled people in editorial positions. It's really, really hard. I don't know as I said, it's not an easy answer.
It's the constant backwards and forwards of ethics in journalism, isn't it? Which is fascinating. I'm interested, kind of moving to the last couple of questions. It really links really well. So when you received your and congratulations on the honorary doctorate from Birmingham University, payback for all the work on setting up the Lynn Henry Centre, I suppose. But huge congratulations to all of us at Bylines. And a quote that, or a slightly truncated quote when you received the honorary doctorate, standing on the podium in your gown. I hope this award reminds students and future change makers that progress is possible, even in industries and spaces that seem resistant to it. If my journey shows anything, it's that change is rarely part of some grand master plan, but often begins with small, persistent steps in the right direction. So I'm just thinking, as you put all that in perspective as we're approaching the end of 2025, what are the small steps, those persistent steps we really need to make right now? What are and that you can advise people that they should be doing? I guess in our context, journalists and editors, citizens generally, what's the most important small step right now?
I really don't know what the most important small step is. I think what I meant by that is that I often use analogies with regards to music because I like music, but I can also use a Chinese phrase, right? So the analogy to music is that some people think of classical music, where what you have is that you have all the sheet music, you know from the beginning exactly how it's going to end. Somebody has a grand master plan. That's how it's going to be done, right? And people often like that. They like the composer, they like the leader, right, who knows that grand master plan, right? I wish I was that person, right? I'm not, right? And so the way that I work is more like jazz, in that I know roughly that I want a world which is in 4/4 time. I know roughly that I want a world which is in the key of G, right? And so I know those rough things. And then working with people, I will be figuring that out as we go along. I'll be working with like-minded people, like Byline, you know, and we will be hopefully making beautiful music, right? Knowing but we don't know when we start off what that piece of music will actually be, And so I compare my work more to jazz, as opposed to thinking that I've known it all before I even start playing the notes. That's a very long-winded way of saying that the Chinese have a phrase, which is, you cross the river by feeling the stones. Right? And I think that's how we know. The key thing is that you know where you want to get to. You want to cross the river. Right? But who knows how you're going to get there? You just feel the stones as you go. You just feel the stones under your feet. And you're like, that one feels a bit slippery. Okay, let's go to another one. And you cross it slowly. So, I always had the classical music versus jazz comparison. I used to use that for years. And then I went to China, and typically they had a fantastic phrase which summed it up like that, which is, you cross the river by feeling the stones. So, I'm not really answering your question as to what's the one thing people should be doing, but we know where we want to get to. We want a better, more equal, progressive society where power is devolved, where people feel that they are empowered and they have more control over their lives. That makes them more mentally healthy. That makes for a fairer society. We know where we want to get to. How we're going to get there, how you're going to get there, how anybody listening to this podcast is going to get there will be up to them, and they will get there by feeling the stones as they cross the river.
So you've got to put your foot in. Maybe that, if it's not in already, got to put your foot
there
in.
You go.
That's the next thing.
Oh, I love it when somebody can extend that metaphor. Fantastic.
We could probably go on for hours. Sharp stones, soft stones, heavy torrents, whether you cross on your own or whatever. Yeah, put your foot in.
Well, I think our last question has just been answered by Marcus.
Fantastic.
Which is brilliant.
Thank you so much.
That's brilliant. Yeah. If you got so the book is out on the 9th of October.
Yeah, is it? I thought it was the 8th. It might be the 9th. Whatever the publisher says.
You might have said, we'll check it out.
It's okay. If it's the 8th, people could wait a day. It's fine.
So the book is out either the 8th or 9th, but they could pre-order it right now.
What I would say, right, about the book and pre-ordering it, and this is really important, and this is something which, and you're still recording, so if there's any way you can feed this in, this would be fantastic. All right, so this is the third book I've written with Lenny. First book was Access All Areas, the Diversity Manifesto for TV and Beyond. And the second book was a collection of essays called Black British Lives Matter. And what we found is that even at the pre-order, so before anybody's even read the book, we were swamped with 1-star reviews on Amazon, and people who were clearly racist, who hadn't read the book. They couldn't have read the book, right? But what that does is that absolutely sinks your algorithm. And so what we need to do is make sure that when you do buy the book, obviously I want you to do it when you buy my book, but please do it whichever book you buy, especially if it's a book that may be subject to racist trolling, give it a review, because people are going to be reviewing those books, and there are racist trolls out there who purposely that aren't buying the book, so I'm not getting any money. The publisher aren't getting any money, and they're purposely trying to sink it. So my plea is, when you're buying books, progressive books, please give them reviews, because the counter is happening in that non-progressive people are actively giving those 0 or 1-star reviews to make sure it sinks the algorithm.
So there you go. We end with a fantastic example of consequential journalism, or podcasting in action. People can go and make the book not sink, but float or rise above the water by giving it a review before it gets out. That's brilliant. What a great way to end. A call to action is always a good thing to end on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Bylines Reports. If you want to help us keep the lights on and keep doing what we're doing, then please contribute to our Chuffed crowdfunder page. Or you can subscribe to us on Substack and get the very best of the Bylines network. You can even experience episodes of this very podcast on there. See you next time, listeners.